Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vladimir Bosanac. I am one of the co-hosts of the Spatial Show here, and also a publisher and co-founder of the Registry, a West Coast-based commercial real estate news organization. Elliot.
Hello, hello. For our first episode, my name's Elliot Golan. I'm also the other host here at the Spatial Show. And by day, I am Senior Vice President for the real estate practice at Allison, a global marketing and PR organization.
Yeah, Elliot. So we should give a little bit of an overview, I guess, of what we're trying to do with this podcast, right? Just for our audience. I am based in the Bay Area. Elliot, you're up in the Pacific Northwest in the great city of Seattle.
Yeah, I know you lived here for a while, so you know what it's like.
I miss it. I miss the rain, although it sounds like you guys get some snow here recently. So I'm not really sure I miss that as much. But certainly the rain actually is one of those things that I enjoy. One of those things that people kind of give me like a weird look when I say I do it. But
Same.
anyway,
Yeah, so this is really exciting, and this is a unique opportunity because both Vlad and myself we have media backgrounds in real estate. And I think because of that, we can offer some insights and some takeaways that are a little harder to come by. Because, I mean, Vlad, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know too many folks that have kind of spent multiple decades hanging around real estate media. Not too many of us kicking around here.
yeah, I guess I don't either. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
We're
I
lifers,
don't know if
yeah.
yeah, should I be leaving the industry soon? I don't know. No, but that's a good point. I mean, our hope with this conversation and with this podcast in general is to elevate some discussions about the industry, focus on some of the things that are really impacting the market. This is not just focused on one part of the geography. It's not just going to be focused on one part of the industry either. We really hope to sort of cast a wide net with our conversations, and we hope that through our upcoming interviews you'll see that we're going to have some interesting folks come on our show here. So with that in mind, Elliot, should we kind of give a little bit of a preview of who
Yeah.
we have today?
Yeah. So today we'll talk about what's coming up. And then I think we need to set the table because it's a lot bigger of a deal than it may sound.
Yeah, so this first show, we're actually starting off with a bit of a focus on San Francisco, not because one of us is based here, but primarily because we do think that there's an important story here. A couple of things about San Francisco, in the last few years, has been that it's been kind of a poster child for kind of what's been gone, everything that's gone wrong with the commercial real estate industries, kind of since COVID-19. Certainly, very high vacancy here, very demanding kind of workforce that doesn't want to go back to the office, right? This is a place that I think a lot of people turn to when they kind of look at the effects of what's been going on in the last couple of years, right? So we thought that was one of the reasons that it will be interesting to focus on this market first. Also, there's a bit of a change of guard. So on a national kind of level, we've had some folks that really come from this region that had a lot of impact on policy and politics and business in general. Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, Kamala Harris. These are all folks that are from the Bay Area that have recently left their positions or moved on. And in Dianne Feinstein's case, passed away as well. And that's been replaced now with other Bay Area figures. Interestingly, Sam Altman, right, from OpenAI, Elon Musk, although he maybe is considering himself as a Texas resident. A
Yeah.
lot of Tesla and what happens kind of here is still here regionally. Andreessen Horowitz, certainly a player in a lot of different areas, but have been prominently featured during the presidential campaign, and not to mention California Governor Gavin Newsom, who is a Bay Area resident and most likely one of the contenders for the presidency here in a few years. So those are some of the reasons why we felt this was important.
It's also just a barometer, I think, in the way that maybe, not everyone might agree with this, but I actually think San Francisco is the barometer for the office market at this stage of our society, not New York, which I think historically is kind of the barometer. And
Oh,
part of
why do you say that, Elliot? Sorry, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is the way landlords have spent the last 10 years talking about tenant attraction. So the topic has been, and not to suggest that these type of tenants are going by the wayside, but the topic, the narrative has been all about how we attract the TAMI tenants, the so-called creatives of the world, as opposed to the fire tenants for the uninitiated. That's financial services, insurance, and real estate, lawyers, stuff like that, right? So the classic sort of mahogany desk office user. But Silicon Valley and San Francisco being the epicenter of this, landlords are trying to attract and have been trying to attract the creatives. The narrative is around the Apples and the Amazons and less
Right.
so around the global law firms. And I think that's really evident by the fact that when some of the big banks in New York were talking about return to office and mandating 5 days, it made a few headlines. When Amazon said it, it dominated the news cycle.
Right. That's right.
So, the epicenter of tech globally is San Francisco. And I think that that office market, therefore, has become the barometer for the nation and not so much the insurance companies taking up space in New York.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think the advent of sort of AI and kind of what it's done, I think the last year and what it's going to continue to do, I think, with a lot of industries, not just in this country but probably globally as well. Also, San Francisco is the epicenter of that as well. The fourth quarter recorded something like 60% of all venture capital invested in the US came to San Francisco. Something like over 134 companies are now AI companies are now based in the Bay Area. Only a few years ago, we had a handful. So it's a really, really interesting and growing market, and we'll talk about that. So that's a little bit of a kind of a preview of the interview, not the interview, but the presentation that we're going to have from Alexander Quinn. He is the sort of West Coast, the Northern California research director for JLL, and he was part of an event that we hosted recently, and we thought that his perspective would be an interesting one to kind of kick off not just this conversation but this podcast, and take us from there on. So
Yeah, and I think,
that's
the office market as a whole, that's what everyone's talking about. There's the affordable housing, there's struggles with there's industrial vacancy, obviously there's retail, and there's other topics, but more or less the narrative is around office. And not to be too bombastic, but the question of, is the office a bit of an old yeller, right? I mean, does it need to be put out to pasture? And obviously the answer is not exactly, but I do think the office has been fundamentally changed and divided into a period of time prior to 2020 and a period of time after 2020. And landlords who are hoping that, well, it'll be back to 19 or 18, I think they're burying their head in the sand. It's not coming.
Yeah, you're right. And anecdotally, some of the things that I've heard from real estate executives, so these are folks that work in tech companies and other firms that lease this real estate, is they feel like they're actually running out of usable space. And so, meaning they feel like they have to reinvest, even though for the last couple of years they've been divesting of real estate and sort of basically telling people, okay, work from anywhere, work from home, work from wherever you want to be. Now they feel like the push towards the office is returning. A number of companies, including Dell, recently have announced that they would like people that are close to sort of a business center, a business office, to return to the office five times a week. So that is definitely changing. However, I don't think that the companies are ready. And I think even with Amazon's mandate, I think they're realizing that the space that they have may not be the space that they need going forward. And so there's some intentionality that I think will, anecdotally, that's one of the things that we're hearing.
And, a lot of it, so usable space also kind of translates to a bit of, let's just call it quality of space. So, one of the big things that was the narrative, I think in 21 mostly, maybe 22, and who knows, maybe it's still kicking around, has been this concept of flight to quality.
Yep.
And I never liked that. So, I hate to to sound like Nostradamus here, but I was in New York. God, time is a strange thing. I believe it was last spring, about a year ago. It may have been longer, and I'm just, the gray hairs are coming quicker than I can keep up with. Talking to the Dursts, Jody Durst, Douglas Durst, the senior folks there. And I was talking with Jody, and I mentioned this idea that I have that I will arrogantly take some credit for, which is I don't believe what we were experiencing was a flight to quality. I believe we were experiencing a flight to trophy. And what I mean is that because of how flexible landlords are being with leasing space, I mean, sort of like, please, please lease space.
Right.
Um, you can get sort of that A plus 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 asset, that truly trophy office space at the price that 5 years ago you maybe got, sort of pretty good space for.
Yeah, that is definitely happening. We've heard that not just about New York, but other markets as well. It does seem like some of that trophy space has been filling up. And some of the, again, this is anecdotal, but maybe there is some science behind it as well, that there is a bit of a challenge in kind of finding that really really high end space anymore. So maybe we're kind of done with that, and there actually is some hope in some markets that perhaps that will help push some of the secondary spaces up, right? They will that the demand for those will increase now, given that we've run out of some of this top stuff. Interestingly, and I know kind of this is like very location specific, but we have heard that because of that flight to trophy, some deals, again, in San Francisco, going for as high as 150 foot, and some are going as low as 24, 25 a foot. So it's a huge discrepancy in kind of what the market is offering, at least in this market. I am probably that kind of discrepancy is not happening elsewhere, but I am curious. We'll probably hear from our audience and from folks, where that is in other markets as well, right? But that has also, obviously, as we know, Elliot pushed what companies are doing, how they're trying to negotiate these deals. I'm sure there are, even though they're telling you they're negotiating stuff at 100, 120, 150 bucks a foot, I'm sure they're doing deals at 70, 80, and 60,
Yeah.
trying to get people in as well, right? So that's kind of an interesting development too.
Well, the concept of effective rent, which I think, in the media, and I don't throw the media under the bus since my first act was in the real estate media and you still are. The topic is typically about asking rents when everyone in the industry knows that's sort of like sticker price on a car. It
Yeah.
doesn't, like, that price is that's where the conversation starts. It's rarely where it ends. But I was talking to a very senior broker in Los Angeles, and by very senior, I mean both in age and title. A good friend of mine, I won't name drop, but he has been an office broker for longer than I have been alive, representing landlords. And I'm not a young man. So that's perspective. And one thing he talked about, which in my years of real estate I had never really been privy to, is the concept of prior occupancy and playing that game with effective rents. So I actually, funny enough, was explaining this concept to my wife this morning. But obviously, effective rent relates to kind of the rent abatements and the free rent, which is classic. Even in the good times,
Yeah.
landlords will say, sign a 25-year deal and I'll give you something. Sign a 10-year deal, I'll give you 6 months free, whatever. And that affects the effective rent, right? Because it's not the price per square foot that you're paying because some of it's free, so it changes the math. What landlords are doing now, I'm hearing, this is incredibly unique, is they're taking it a step further and saying, okay, the lease starts, for lack of complication, let's just say January 1. Why don't you move in August? And what that means is to the tenant, it's just additional free rent. Well, it's
Sure.
free rent. I got the place for $0, and it doesn't really matter if it's on the front end, the back end, the side end. Who cares? For me as a business, but for the landlord, that free rent doesn't mess with your effective rent, which is, of course, what the market is looking at as it relates to sort of comps, if you will, to use the residential term. And that is incredibly unique and creative and just shows that, I mean, we see it in the vacancy rates. It's tough out there, man, and landlords have to make it work.
Yeah. One other thing that's kind of interesting, not terribly present in the news, but related to this conversation is the tenants do tend to care who their landlord is, obviously. And one of the things that we notice is that they are trying to be very careful about going into buildings where they perhaps anticipate that maybe the landlord will not be around for much longer. There have been dispositions over the last 12, 18 months
Yeah,
across the nation in different markets. That will most likely continue to be the case in 2025. It doesn't seem like that's stopping. And as buildings are either returned to a lender or sold at a discount or whatever, the tenants do wonder who their landlord is going to be. And from at least a couple of conversations I've had, it is a challenging process to change landlords. It's not something that they look forward to, and it adds another layer of complexity in this market because it's just another variable as
sure.
they discuss with their tenant reps, right? Do we really want to go into this building? Is this going to be kind of a pain in the butt for us later on? And it's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it was always a thing, right? It's great to lease space from, say the Dursts again or Brookfield, right? I mean, the chances of these companies going under is, I mean, heck, I guess Lehman went under, but it's very small, right? These companies are going to be around, and it's not unlike the apartment scene, right? I mean, when you rent an apartment from Joe, who owns 4 units in the middle of Studio City, California, you expect a certain degree of maintenance. When you rent from Graystar at some 500 unit megaplex, you expect a little bit different. And there's upsides and downsides, of course, right? At Graystar, good luck getting anyone on the phone, and Joe lives across the street. But Joe's going to try to fix the garbage disposal himself, even though he has no training, whereas Graystar is going to send out a professional.
Right.
So I think what we're seeing is the office market translating that way is, some of these regional players are they going to be around in 5 years, or is Brookfield, Kilroy, EQ Office, etc., are they just going to end up being the predominant landlords, other than, of course, the lenders?
Yep. Yep. Well, it remains to be seen, and we'll obviously keep our eye and finger on the pulse of that and how that continues to evolve. So, Elliot, before we turn it over to our first guest here, I think the last thing we wanted to just mention a little bit is some of the return to office
Yeah.
points here, and I'd like to kind of hear where you think this is going. Is this a real shift? It definitely seems that way, but what are your thoughts?
I think it's a shift. I don't think it's the seismic shift that perhaps is trying to be communicated, because I still think at the end of the day, all companies have a few things in common. And one of the biggest things they have in common is, not unlike sports, you want the best players on your team. So at a certain level, if there's a person you think can really help your business, I mean, they're, I don't know, a Wayne Gretzky, a LeBron James, right? They're that kind of talent. I still think they're going to be able to say, I want to work from home and I don't particularly care what your policy is, because the
I
guys
I
across
think you're right.
the street,
Yeah,
right?
and I think that's sort of that construct is as old as time, probably, right? I remember my days 17, 18 years ago when I worked in tech. We had people that were the sort of key developer that lived in Tahoe because he just wanted to live in Tahoe, right? And it was just one of those things that even before work from home was a thing, it was a thing. So I
Right.
think there are people like that, 100%. And it is interesting. So JP Morgan, Dell
Yep.
Computer, Amazon, I mean, these are certainly companies that have publicly announced that they're sort of going back to full-time work from home. Apple has been this way, I think, for the last couple of years. I mean, I don't think they've made any announcements. They just sort of pushed that way.
Yeah.
Interestingly, Citibank just announced, and we are, recording this here in early February, but Citibank just announced in New York, they're going to maintain their hybrid policy, which is interesting.
Talent retention and acquisition.
Exactly.
Someone who works in PR, I can tell you, brilliant. Because all of the folks at Chase are saying, well, I mean, they're probably going to call me a vice president too. They're solvent. My paycheck isn't, going to be late. To do the same thing, in my sweatpants. Why do I work at Chase?
Right, right. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. It is going to be interesting. I think it is. Look, I think we're kind of done with where we were a couple of years ago. I think in many ways, I think some industries will continue to manage this as a very useful tool for talent retention and talent and for recruiting in general, right? I think you're absolutely right. I think certain people will utilize this, and I think it becomes a lever that they get to use when they feel if it's sort of the last kind of thing they need to maybe negotiate to bring somebody on board.
Right.
This is perhaps the type of flexibility that they will offer them, but undoubtedly it does seem that some presence in the office will be required
Yeah,
across the board, and I think that's just kind of where we're heading into, and that's to be expected.
that's good for the industry. But
Yeah.
the other thing is also, I think, is the I don't want to say looming because it makes it seem like doomsday clock has hit a certain level here, but another thing that is looming is, of course, that the average office lease is what, 10 years, pretty kind of classical term. Well, if you signed in 16, 17, 18, or 19,
Yeah.
you've still been playing the landlord. And as you know, most landlords have not been like letting people out because they need every dollar they can get. So what happens when all that space over the next 5 years rolls over is back available? Are we going to see all of them completely dispose of real estate space? Of course not. But we're going to see some percentage completely go. So we've been hybrid or
Yeah.
completely remote for a few years, and we're fine with that. Some percentage are going to reduce their space, and I don't know that any percentage is going to increase its space.
Well, I think some will increase. We just don't know who, right? It might be companies. Clearly companies in the AI space will increase
Yeah.
as maybe they signed a 2-year, 3-year deal at 10,000 square feet, and they went from 50 employees to 150 or 1,000. So I think we'll see some movement there. What's interesting about what you said about those leases rolling is that some of the feedback that we've heard is that will actually make 2025 and potentially early part of 2026 look maybe worse than it really is, because leases will continue to get done in
Right.
2025. That's undoubtable, but the sort of velocity of kind of these leases coming off and companies taking maybe 80%, 70%, 60% of what they needed or what they had in the past may still make things look a little bit worse than it really is. So I am curious how the optics are going to shape up in 2025. It'll be an interesting year for sure. I don't think one without challenges.
Yeah. And I think one of the last things that I haven't seen anyone write about, and frankly, I've only thought of it in the last few days, is so much leasing and some of the biggest headline leases in the last year. And I'll just call out OpenAI as a perfect example in San Francisco. It's occupying sublease space because the sublease market has obviously dominated the last 4 years because why get spec space that needs a bunch of TI when I can walk into Uber's gorgeous headquarters
Right.
and park my people there?
Right.
So, and that makes headlines a little misleading, right? OpenAI signing a lot of square footage in San Francisco is the return of office. No, it's not, because Uber was paying the landlord. Now OpenAI is paying the landlord, but the delta on the vacancy is zero. Now, of course, these companies will grow and that will help. But to my point here, and I've been rambling a little bit, is when the sublease market becomes less impactful because those leases end, there's not this glut of sublease space on the market. Landlords are going to have to up their game on vacant space and TI offerings and saying, okay, over the last 3 or 4 years, you could occupy some beautiful space that some tenant wasn't using and sublease it. The sublease market is going to decrease as these leases end. It has to. It's just
Yeah.
math.
Yeah. Well, and this is why CBRE purchased Industrious, right? I mean, so I think everyone's trying to figure out, how to utilize some of this extra space, and it's an innovative, creative way to try to do that. So it'll be an interesting year for sure. Elliot, before we turn it over, any other final thoughts here?
Well, I'm excited to kick off this journey. I think real estate is an endlessly fascinating topic and one that can be talked about and should be talked about. And I think it's also one that has this, I'll quote a close friend of mine that will likely be a guest here at some point, has a habit of kind of burying its head in the sand. And hopefully, we're going to bring some really good stories from people that are in the belly of the beast, telling you sort of how it is, what's really happening.
That's my hope as well. So, without further ado, Elliot, we'll continue our conversation obviously next week. But here's our recording of the presentation by Alexander Quinn.
Hello, I'm Alexander Quinn. I'm the Director of Research for the Northwest for JLL. So I do all things commercial real estate for the West Coast. You can consider me like the weatherman. I don't necessarily have an opinion about, I'm not trying to be positive or negative, I just explain the weather. So don't blame me for some of this information that I'm about to share. All right, so let's just go into it a little bit. I'm going to go first really big and go U.S. macro outlook and just where we're seeing on a U.S. level. The big thing for right now is that borrowing costs are going up based on a shift in the administration. We expect a more inflationary environment, both from a fiscal management policy and also from potential tariffs that would increase inflation. So you can see that it jumped from around 4.37 to 4.61. That's 30 basis points, actually a little bit less than that, but that's pretty substantial from September. What happened from September to November? Polls started coming in, and the Trump administration looked like they were going to win, and it already started predicting in advance that this was going to be an issue. So what it meant is in terms of the federal Fed rate, now the forecast out is it's going to be higher for longer. You probably read this in the Wall Street Journal. This is in fact what we anticipate. So it was expecting it to fall further. Now, actually, Wells Fargo just came out today and they said, you know what, we're not going to assume as many rate cuts as we thought based on what we think will be additional growth, but also because of these tariffs and additional inflationary conditions. So no bueno. And then we're also here's just the inflation estimates as we stand. Inflation is incredibly hard to predict, but we do expect that there will be higher for longer as a result of some of the rhetoric that's going around at the administration level. This is fascinating. I don't know if you know this guy named Torsten Slok, excuse me. He's an economist from Apollo Global. I would recommend following him. He sends out a one slide a day. He's a great economist, in my opinion. Anyway, this is, if you look at the red, this is inflation expectations. It's from the University of Michigan between independents, Democrats, and Republicans. And you can see there's incredible discordance between those parties. You're seeing over here on the right, it's red, it's zero. We're not going to have any inflation. And then the brown and the blue are like, oh, yes, we are. We're going to have real inflation. I think I'm going to go with the independents and Democrats and think that we're going to have inflation. And so just here are some of the risks that we face. I'm not going to be doom and gloom here in the entire presentation, but this is just kind of what we think are some of the uphill battles. There's a lot of news that's coming out. Protectionism is generally not good for markets and for the economy. So we are worried about this as economists. Okay, so that was my national view. Now I'm going to go directly into the Greater Bay Area. And so every year I do a forecast. So in February of 2024, I said, okay, these are the things I think are going to happen. And I thought I'd frame our presentation today based on that principle. So what we're looking at is I said, well, there's going to be multifamily rent growth of 5%. Bay Area population will continue to grow. We'll see the Bay Area will receive about 40% of VC investment, which is historically where we've been. We'll see about $20 billion of IPO activity in the Bay Area. Unemployment will increase, but office occupancy, physical occupancy will also increase, which usually don't happen. And then office vacancy will go up, but remote stance will fall. And then AI will lease another 1 million square feet, where they leased 1.2 million the year prior. And then finally, life science vacancy will increase, but we'll actually see net occupancy gains. So this is what I said. So let's test myself and see how well I did. All right, so okay, there we go. All right. So the first one, rent growth. Nope, didn't happen. All the forces imply that we should see multifamily rent growth within the Greater Bay Area, but the San Jose saw about 4%, San Francisco saw about 2% in annual rent growth, and East Bay actually was negative. The infusion of supply in downtown Oakland actually meant that rents did not increase at the same level. There's all the ingredients would tell you that we are poised for another rent growth, and we expect that to in fact happen on the multifamily side. But it was overall around 3%, so not above 5% as I had forecast. We're currently at 96% occupancy, give or take, within the greater Bay Area. That's a very healthy occupancy level, and we would think as long as we start to see income growth, that means that rent growth will in fact occur. So I'm going to double down on this and say yes, it's going to happen this year, not it didn't happen last year. But for me, that means no, I got that one wrong. That is incorrect. All right, so then let's go to population gain. So population gain, I said the Bay Area would see growth in population. Well, the numbers are not out necessarily, come out in March, but we're seeing all the hints that in fact the Bay Area did see population growth last year. And the reason that happens is because we are a receiver of international migration. This is a fascinating graph on the right here. It shows the blue is the international migration, the orange is natural growth. So what's happened? Over time, like many Western nations, we've seen a decline in the birth rate and continuation of the death rate. Those two things continue to happen. And the result is that we're not seeing a lot of natural population growth, except maybe if you're in Utah. So where we're seeing really growth is really in places of international, it's those gateway markets like New York, Houston, Los Angeles, and San Francisco Bay Area. So that's where we're seeing it. And this is that map, if you look at just the Bay Area overall, that light blue represents the net change. If you look at the kind of the dark blue or the, I guess blue, I don't know what to call it, that area is the domestic outmigration. What people don't realize within the Bay Area is that historically the Bay Area has been a constant outflow of domestic outmigration and inflow of international migration. It's hard to believe that the Santa Clara has foreign-born 36%. New York is 33. So it's incredibly much a receiver of international talent. It's important to us. And actually, this is my concern coming into this year. I don't think we're going to see that same infusion of demand simply because of a different policy as it relates to international migration. So yes, I was right. I was right on that one. I don't know if I'm going to be right on the second one, but here you go. So VC investment, I said 40%. Well, actually, we did way better than that. AI went through the steroids, and we actually saw 46% overall. It's the highest we've ever recorded. So fascinating. And actually, San Francisco achieved 21%. So for every dollar spent in the U.S. in VC investment, this 7x7 city accounted for 21 cents of it. It's a remarkable number. And this just shows what it looks like. It's $47 billion in total investment. New York City, much bigger in population, was at 27 billion. So not slightly half, but almost half. It's incredible. So where I was wrong, though, is I said VC investment would actually go down because we saw Fed rates increase, and generally you would expect VC investment to essentially decrease. That's not what happened. VC investment went up year over year. So that was a split. I was kind of in between. I'm giving myself a half point for that one. Okay, now I said also on the IPO side. So on the IPO side, I said $20 billion, and that was a clear win. We had Astera Labs, did really well. Reddit has become almost like a meme stock. They've done well. Rubrik, all of those are done exceptionally well. We're at $60 billion in terms of IPO this year. We think that that's going to actually go a lot higher in 2025, driven by companies like Chime and others, and we expect that number to essentially be double that at $40 billion. So yes, I was right on that one. So good, I'm doing okay. All right, now I said unemployment would increase, but physical occupancy would also increase. Those things don't normally align with one another, but we're in this existential reality of office where it's not necessarily whether or not you have office employees, it's whether your office employees in fact come to the office. So that's where we're at the moment. Right now, we actually did see an increase in unemployment across the board, albeit marginal. In fact, I think this number, is going to get worse. We're going to see unemployment increase really in the construction sector, retail sector, and leisure and hospitality sector in the Bay Area. So I expect this number to in fact go higher than where it is now. Depends on some of the labor force questions that we're all facing, but we would expect it. So this is what I think is happening. It used to be the engineering rate unemployment rate was around 2%. So you were happy to have your engineer work from wherever they wanted to. And that's ultimately changing based on some of the large language models and AI. And we do think that there's this dynamic of potentially peak technology worker levels. In other words, if you are a typical programmer, your job is at risk, and you're thinking about being in the office and being more in person, because if you're just typing in code, that's not actually helping that much. So we think that there's more interest now in getting back into the office, and it's showing up in our numbers. So if you look at cell phone location data, so if you have an Apple phone or a Google phone or any phone that has location services on, we are tracking you. We are Big Brother, and we know where you are. And we've been looking at you and recognizing that if you're in downtown San Francisco in the CBD, more than 2.5 hours on Monday through Friday, we can actually figure out what that activity is in comparison to 2019. And year over year, it's been growing around 8% per year. So we are seeing it in the numbers. We're seeing it in the BART ridership numbers. It's incredibly painfully incremental, but it is happening. So yes, I was correct on that. All right, so let's move on. All right, so office increase will increase, but remote work will further dissipate. So yes, office vacancy did increase. We knew this already because there were a lot of planned, this was actually my easiest bet. There were a lot of planned vacancies already in play, so we knew there was going to be increased vacancy in the San Francisco market. That looks different, well, okay. So what we see right now is almost peak vacancy. In fact, in Q4 of last year, we saw net positive absorption for the city of San Francisco of 20 basis points. So woohoo, we're up down to 34.2%. It's a slight marginal gain, but we actually think that's going to happen again come the end of this year. So Q3 and Q4, based on what we see in leasing activity, we had a record level of leasing activity of 7.2 million square feet. That's the highest since the pandemic. So we're starting to see some demand on that front. The markets that are really sucking wind, mid-market, really tough, 47% vacancy. Showplace Square, 36%. A lot of that's Airbnb space. It got leased to Scale AI, some of it did. So that's improving, but still really bad. South of Market, Soma, a lot of sublease space, 45% vacancy. So those markets are definitely hurting more. A good friend of mine calls the area on the east shoreline, he's calling it the Fertile Crescent. I think it's a brilliant idea. The idea that along the line there is really where the quality exists and where there'll still be demand, but those that are further west are going to have more challenging conditions for a while. So, and it's kind of playing out in terms of leasing demand as a percent of inventory. So all this is doing is saying, this is how much space is in that individual submarket. How much leasing has there been since 2022? And what it does is it just gives an idea of, okay, well, where are tenants willing to move to in this softer market? And what it's telling us is Mission Bay, kind of an outlier. New supply feels like Toronto West. That's generally doing okay. If you are in Jackson Square, okay. If you're in the Showplace Square, that's kind of a unique situation. That was a couple of leases. That was Scale AI. But North Financial District also, we're showing some demand there. Where we're not seeing demand is in Soma and mid-market. We're hoping that'll change soon. We are starting to see a little bit of transaction and activity, especially amongst PDR space, in fact. Growing demand in terms of tenant demand in that sector. What we're seeing in terms of rents, though, I know a lot of you are hoping to get a rent break on your office building. Well, it's around 20% overall, but it really depends. So I know brokers say that a lot, but it's true. There's a variance across the market. I'll give you an example. Transamerica building, they're doing deals at $150 a square foot on the upper floors. You can go to mid-market and do a deal for $25 full service gross on a sublease. So incredible variance. This is net effective rents. It accounts for free rents, tenant allowance, and the like. And we're down around 40%. So while the asking rents say 20%, basically you can get a huge other deal. So it's roughly around 40% on direct deals in San Francisco proper. But it varies. So let's do 555 Cal, Transamerica. The average rents of trophy buildings, which are really buildings that have bridge-to-bridge views, those ones are averaging $95 overall. Whereas if you are a B and C product, which are buildings in Mid-Market or West Soma, those are going for $43 on average. So very different. So that's one point. And then the other point is, are people coming back to the office or not? What are we seeing in the numbers? And this is fascinating. So this takes Lightcast job posting information, and all I did is I looked at office workers or office-related jobs, and I compared where job postings said that they were remote or whether they're in person. And what you're seeing is the gray area represents remote jobs for San Francisco opportunities in the office sector. And they're down around 16% year over year in San Francisco. In San Francisco, if you want to be there in person, it's up 4%. So that really shows you the rub. Employers are wanting you to be in the office, especially if they're going to pay San Francisco prices. So that's really showing up. And I think you're going to see more of that trending going forward. All right, so yes, I was correct. All right, so finally, well, this is 7, so there's one more after this. But this is like the question that I said we're going to see another 1 million square feet of leasing activity in the AI space, and AI is going to continue to roll. I think that's actually even. I know a lot of you are scared about DeepSeek. The reality is we think that this is actually going to continue regardless of whether it's a large language model. The app ecosystem will, in fact, continue within San Francisco, and we'll see that grow. And we're already seeing those growth requirements, by the way. But we went from roughly 3.8 to 4.8 million square feet of total footprint in San Francisco alone. So another 1 million square feet. It's fascinating to look at. This is a great map to show this. So this is 2020. These are how many leases we had. I'm going to show this in cumulative by annualized basis. So this is 2 leases in 2020 that we had for AI firms. Then we had 5 more, so 7 leases, 14 leases, 49 leases, 135 leases. So huge growth in this sector. A lot of small Series A and seed funded companies, but they're growing very fast, and we're seeing them double down on space. So Harvey AI has more than expanded, Databricks expanded in their building. We're seeing a lot of these companies continue to grow at substantial pace. So what our projection is next year is actually fewer leases, but more square footage, because a lot of those Series A funding companies, about 10 to 15%, they'll go from 10,000 square feet to 20,000, 25,000 square feet. So fewer leases, but actually more square footage. So yes, I think I got that one right too. All right, so last, life science. Life science was the darling during 2021 and 2022 when everybody was working remotely. That meant that there's a problem now, because we have this huge infusion of space. This is a traditional supply-demand dynamic where you've got too much inventory coming on in relation to the number of PhDs that are available to fill that space. And we were essentially overbuilding because we got all this cash. So we went from a market of 27 million square feet in 2019 to around 44 million square feet now. So that's a massive growth swing. So all this increase in vacancy, which is now at 30%, that is really driven by just that injection of supply. It's not really the same thing of all of a sudden these tenants are leaving. It's a different dynamic. So, but we did see that in fact the number went down marginally. There was a lot of consolidation in the life science market. I'm also doubling down on this because the leasing activity would imply, and also the VC investment would imply, a rebound in life science demand. That means that we'll see a net injection, or occupancy will increase, but vacancy will also increase because we still have more inventory that has yet to come online. And the result will be that we'll start to see it stabilize. But we need this to continue to get us back to a much more stable market. So that is a split. That's kind of in the middle is what we're looking at. So if you look at it overall, I got about 75%. It gives you an idea that I'm not going to be right every time, which I actually thought that was pretty good. But last year it was 66%. But I have bets for next year. We'll see multifamily rent growth. I talked through a lot of these. We'll see IPO growth. VC investment will be around $140 billion. So in fact, I think it's going to be a little bit lower. AI leasing will be another million plus. Office leasing will first increase. Vacancy will increase because we know of some vacancies that are happening, and then it's going to start to decrease towards the second half of the year, and we'll see that number actually go down year over year. Unemployment will increase, but office occupancy will also grow. I think that's also kind of an obvious one. And then license will continue to rise, but we'll see net occupancy gains. So that is it. Thank you. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm happy to take questions.
You grade yourself.
I-
75 over 66%, you grade yourself.
I did. I graded myself. Yeah, I do that. Yeah.
Do you have any projections longer term on vacancy when that peaks?
Well, actually, we think we're near peak vacancy probably second quarter of this year, and then we're going to see it slowly absorb. Our current level of what we define as natural vacancy, I should explain what natural vacancy is. Natural vacancy is the vacancy rate in which rents increase at the rate of inflation. All right, so we think that's somewhere around 2032, but it will be different based on different supply. So if you are a trophy asset or Class A asset, that market stabilizes much earlier than that. If you're a Class B or C segment, that's a longer duration is what we anticipate. And again, also the other thing that's really interesting is what historically was the natural vacancy rate of San Francisco was roughly around 12%. We think that number is going to be more like Austin and Chicago, which are much more supply unconstrained. And that means the vacancy rate will be, at natural vacancy, will be somewhere around 18 to 20%. We'll have a lot of structural vacancy that'll just be latent supply. Yeah. I can't see, so whatever. Yeah.
The AI demand, do you see that as coming from a few big players?
No.
Or a lot of small players?
Yeah, so really where the growth is, it's really in that AI ecosystem. So these are the Harvey AIs, Hippocratic AI, Midjourney. There's a bunch of these firms that are essentially above the large language models. If you can think of it as the mobile phone created all these opportunities for apps, we think the same thing is going to happen on the AI side. So most of the growth that we in fact envision is not in the large language models, which is helpful, but really it is those apps that sit on top of those models. That's where actually DeepSeek in fact helps the AI ecosystem because the cost of compute is so significantly high as a major barrier. To the more that comes down, the more these apps become feasible.
With your prediction of Class B taking longer to stabilize, what happens to CRE loans in the next 24 months? That come due.
Yeah, they continue to struggle. This is an issue. We're going to see those that were bought, anywhere from 20. Every capital stack is different, but anybody who was bought their property from 2016 onward are enduring significant pain. And now we have comps. We have comps in the system that show, dollar, $250. It's different type of buildings, but $250 to $300 a square foot. So that's well below the imputed basis of a lot of these, the loan on these buildings. So a lot of these buildings were bought at $900, $800 a square foot. Their loan to value was 50%, $400, $450 a square foot. And yet we're seeing deals now happening at $300 a square foot, which presents a problem. So those that have, a long-term view, they'll do fine. And we know those that have the capital to essentially withstand this storm, but there's others that are going to endure the pain, unfortunately. Thank you. And with that note.
Thank you. Thanks, Gwen.